Lawmakers wrapped up the first week of veto session. We'll talk about it next on CapitolView. Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of CapitolView, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with us this week is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science with the University of Illinois, Springfield. Professor, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
And longtime Statehouse Observer Mike Lawrence. Mike, glad to see you.
Good to be here.
So lawmakers wrapped up their first week of veto session, but first I want to chat a little bit about a race that was still hanging out there from the election. We weren't certain who was the winner. Talking about the Illinois Treasurer's race, we have found out this week that Mike Frerichs will be the next state treasurer. Professor Redfield, can you catch us up a little bit on what was going on and why it took this long to determine who the winner was?
Well, the race was between Mike Frerichs and Tom Cross, who was the former minority leader in the Illinois House, and the reason it took so long is that we have gone to both early voting and we have a lot more mail-in voting than we used to have. Used to be absentee, now it's just mail-in, and then we also had some same-day registration, which could raise issues. Both of those things, the mail-in voting and the same-day registration, about provisional ballots in terms of whether or not someone had requested a ballot and then not sent it in and then came to show up to vote. And so there are more votes out there that it takes a while to count. And what happened is that, the Cook County and the city of Chicago, there are just a lot more voters there than anywhere else. And so the fact that there was a portion of the vote that wasn't counted, that, the larger part of that was from Cook County and Chicago, and those were areas where Frerichs had a much stronger lead. I mean, he ran very strong in those two counties, and so the lead kept getting smaller and smaller as the counties came in. It also illustrated, so we don't see this all the time, but clearly, we have 14 different election jurisdictions in the state. And so, they all have to count, they all have to report, and the administration of elections, it's probably not nearly as efficient and modern as it should be. It generally nobody notices, but when you get a race that's close, then all of a sudden people are wondering what's going on.
And this race ended up being, folks were saying it might be the closest treasurer's race in history. I don't know who keeps track of that, but it didn't end up being nearly as close as people thought it would be. Why did we see Democrat Mike Frerichs, pull so far ahead, where Democrat governor candidate Pat Quinn fell short?
Well, I think there was a fall off in the Quinn vote. I think there were a lot of Democrats who supported Frerichs as a Democrat candidate, and they were turned off on Quinn. And I think a big reason that Quinn ended up losing the election was he did not do as well with the Democrat base, either in terms of turnout and level of support as you might expect a Democrat to do.
And the other thing that was surprising is, Frerichs ran very strong downstate, and Cross did not. And Frerichs is a downstater, but again, whereas in the suburbs, Cross's numbers weren't nearly as good as Rauner's, and so, if where Frerichs actually won the race was downstate, and which is not, certainly no longer a Democratic, if it ever was. It used to be competitive, and now it's pretty much a Republican stronghold when you get downstate. But Frerichs ran, his numbers were much better downstate than Governor Quinn's, and so it's, as Mike says, it's the base, and it's also maybe a little bit about campaigns that Frerichs had a little more money, did a little more TV. in a race this close, where an office was just no visibility.
And I think Furwick's commercials helped him. You know, they were positive. They were the kind that kind of made you smile on occasion. You know, this tall guy interacting with shorter people. And in a campaign season that was marked by its nastiness, the fact that you had a positive, I'd say clever commercial, I think probably helped him, and I think especially downstate.
Yeah, I wasn't going to bring up the height edge, but both he and Bruce Rauner are very tall candidates. It was a good year for tall candidates in Illinois.
Yeah. Actually, that's probably the meeting that, if there was a meeting, was supposed to take place between Frericks and Rauner today, and that may be the only time that Rauner will have to look up to any other Illinois politician in terms of the next 4 years in office.
Well, a lot of folks out there might be hard-pressed to even name who the treasurer or the comptroller is. Why are these offices important to the parties to, get a win on one of these offices?
Well, I think they're important because they've traditionally been stepping stones, particularly the treasurer's office. And going back to, actually I could go further back, but let's talk about Adlai Stevenson III, who was state treasurer. I'm sure Adlai Stevenson III didn't grow up as a little boy thinking, boy, what I really want to be someday is state treasurer of Illinois. But the fact is, the office was open at the right time for him. He ran for it, and he used that to launch a successful campaign for the U.S. Senate. So Alan Dixon is another former treasurer who then became Secretary of State and U.S. Senator. So again, especially the treasurer's office has been a launching pad. Not so much at this point with the comptroller's office. Dan Hines did make a move for both U.S. Senate and then later for governor. He wasn't successful, but the fact that he had served as comptroller probably helped to make him a more competitive candidate than he would have been otherwise.
Yeah, so it's building a farm team, people who are ambitious, they can see it as a stepping stone. And I agree with Mike. I think treasurer, people know kind of intuitively what a treasurer does. People have no idea what a comptroller is, and so I'm not sure that lends itself as well.
Well, we mentioned that there was expanded early voting and same-day registration, same-day voting under this election. The sponsor of the legislation that enabled all of that said this week that he would like to see it extended. It actually was just a short-term expansion. I'm curious to see what both of you think about how things went and whether that is a possibility or not. Some people were critical of this expansion, saying that it was just for this election to benefit Democrats. Do you think we'll see this continue on in Illinois?
I think so. I think that there's a push now to get it through in the veto session. And clearly same-day registration worked better in the county than it did in the city of Chicago. I think David Orr is an example of a county clerk who really values, understands, and runs a good operation in terms of administering elections. And so, once you get the hang of it, you can make same-day registration work. It's interesting, again, in a democratically controlled state, we certainly have had a pattern of trying to make it easier for people to vote, expand the opportunities. Exactly the opposite is what we've seen in some states that are controlled by Republican governors and Republican legislators. They're used to tend to get voter ID and those sorts of things. And this is another area we really don't know whether the governor has a strong opinion, the governor-elect has strong opinions one way or another. But that's probably one of the reasons the legislature, the Democrats are trying to push this through is in the veto session is they're not certain, how the governor-elect is going to react.
Mike, any thoughts on the expanded voting on this election?
No, I agree with Kent, Jamey. I think that if the Democrats want to keep it they've got to make the move now during the veto session. It's possible that a governor of honor would sign the bill, but Republicans in Illinois historically have been wary of easing registration requirements, and they claim that, and there's some basis for this, that there has been election fraud in Illinois and a history of it. Now, the fact of the matter is there's probably been election fraud by both parties in Illinois, but the Republicans tend to make the case that it's the Democrats who are the worst violators, and therefore we should not be easing registration requirements and making it too easy for people to play some games.
Well, and lawmakers wrapped up the first week of veto session this week, as is often the case when veto session runs multiple weeks. Not a lot happened this week. This is kind of the time for them to lay the groundwork for things that they want to get done, try to build some momentum, get the ideas out there. One of the issues that supporters are really trying to lay the groundwork for this week is increasing the state's minimum wage. There was a non-binding referendum on the ballot this year, and Illinois voters weighed in with resounding support for increasing the minimum wage. Do we think lawmakers are going to be able to get there on this issue during the veto session or possibly the lame duck session? Professor Redfield?
Well, they have taken the bill that was in the Senate and modified it so that it would take effect next July, so it only needs 60 votes. I mean, that's in the House and 30 in the Senate. That's the first step. The governor-elect has made it very clear that he would be supportive of minimum wage, but only if it were tied to business reforms, things having to do business regulation, business taxes, workers' comp, tort reform, those kinds of issues. There were difficulties in the spring. It passed the Senate and did not pass the House. There were questions in the spring about whether there were 60 votes there in the House. And there's a larger strategic issue of, is it to the Democrats' advantage to take it off the table now, or does it have some value as they putting it off until the spring in terms of the negotiations that are come over the budget and over the other things that Governor-elect Rauner wants. And so I don't think it's clear at this point, though, that it's going to pass. It could, but the signs are that it's going to be difficult to do.
Mike, how much are the results of that non-binding referendum a factor here? I mean, the polling indicated that people generally supported this issue. Is it a deal breaker? Will it push it over the line?
In the final analysis,
or maker, I guess.
In the final analysis, I don't think the referendum makes that big a difference. I think what this will come down to are some of the strategic questions that Kent just talked about, and perhaps even more so, whether Speaker Madigan believes that he can put 60 votes on and not endanger any potential targets in the next election. There aren't many competitive races anymore in Illinois, relatively speaking, but in those races, they tend to be in areas that, by definition, could go either way, Democrat and Republican, and I think the question will be whether the Speaker believes it would be helpful or harmful to these potential targets, his members who would be most at risk to vote for or against the minimum wage hike.
You're talking about basically passing it in veto session or before the new session comes in with Democratic votes. And if you make it part of something that takes place in the spring, then you're going to have Republican and Democratic votes. If it is a deal, then you will have a structured roll call and you'll have some Democratic votes on things to cut workers' comp and do business regulation reform, you'll have Republican votes on minimum wage. I mean, that will be the deal, is that both sides will be expected to put up some members on bills, and that way they will protect vulnerable people from having to take votes that might hurt them in the next election. It's also to the leader and the leaders, Madigan and Collerton and Grouners, I think it's in their interest to be perceived as cooperating. Rauner wants to get things done. The legislative leaders want the Democratic legislature to be perceived as being, cooperative and working on the state's problems, instead of being a target 2 years from now to, throw out the do-nothing obstructionist Democratic legislature. And so, this could all fall apart, but I think there is some possibility for cooperation, and I think minimum wage might be part of that, fit better into that in the spring than just taking it off the table now. But it's clear, big labor, certain elements of labor, SEIU, Service Employees International Union, really wants it passed now. There's a big push to get it done, and it's going to be interesting.
It strikes me that the issues we're talking about today with this veto session pale in comparison to what we could have been talking about if Pat Quinn would have won re-election. Because I think the nature of this veto session would have been dramatically different. We'd be talking about extension of the temporary income tax increase and who knows what else. And the election of a Republican has just politically put a limitation on this session.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, is it surprising that Democrats maybe aren't taking more advantage of trying to push Democratic legislation through while they still have a Democratic governor to sign it? Why is that?
Well, I think that, right now you're talking about, you're putting together a vote in a lame duck session. It's difficult. Sometimes you think members that aren't coming back, well, they're going to be free agents, and lots of times members that aren't coming back for whatever reason feel, mostly here you've only got one person that's kind of left involuntarily, which is Mike Jacobs, the Democratic senator, and so I think some of these issues are, if they had the votes to do them now, they'd had the votes to do them in the spring, and would have put things out there that would have helped Governor Quinn in his reelection. So I think these are tough issues, and I think the Democrats would have been emboldened if Governor Quinn had been elected, and it would have been an opportunity to kind of get some business done with some people that you could get to vote for things that were retiring and stuff. And now nobody knows for sure how things are going to go with Governor Rauner. It puts a lot more caution into everybody because there's just a lot of uncertainty, and so everybody's kind of keeping their powder dry.
Well, and speaking of Bruce Rauner, he held his first Statehouse press conference Thursday when we're taping the show. And what is the takeaway from that? He came down to Springfield, held a press conference on the second floor where the governor's office is located. There was a lot of, photo ops and a lot of folks there, but did he say much new? Is there any news coming out of that?
I certainly didn't see any news. He wants the governor not to make a lot of, appointments and things, but you can't put state government on hold for 3 months, and the governor is the governor. And he indicated that he was surprised, stunned, I'm not sure what, that the state's fiscal situation was so bad, but that's, if he's just discovering that, he's the last person in Illinois to realize that. And no, we didn't hear any specifics. What are you going to do with the income tax? What's your plan? What does your budget look like? And so if you're looking for kind of now here are my solutions for all of these terrible problems. He punted pensions, essentially said, well, we'll see what the court does, and which I think everybody assumes the court's not going to throw the bill out, and that's another thing on the long list of crises that he's going to have to deal with right out of the bat. So good photo opportunity, looks, gubernatorial and all of those things, but I don't think there was we learned anything about that's going to help us predict how things are going to go in the next 6 months.
And I don't think he should rush that. This is a very, very important period for him. It may seem like a long time between Election Day and the day he raises his hand and takes his oath. It isn't a long time at all when you're trying to put together an administration and really get a grasp on the mega state issues, but also what is going on in the agencies, what are the major problems, and then probably paramount, putting together your team, your staff, your department heads. And I worked for Governor Edgar, and when he won in 1990, he had a corps from the Secretary of State's office. He'd been Secretary of State for 10 years, to bring with him a managerial corps, or at least to choose from. He was going into an administration that was essentially a Republican administration. So even though he made a lot of changes at the cabinet level, the fact of the matter is he had a core of people in all the agencies who were friendly to him. I don't think Governor-elect Rauner's going into that situation. The Republicans haven't been in power for 12 years. And a lot of the Republican professionals, state government professionals, have moved on since then. And I think it makes sense for him to get a good assessment. Now, that doesn't mean lay back. It means you got to charge ahead. But to me, it would not make sense for him to be out right now making all sorts of pronouncements and assessments on what he's going to do. He's got to get a handle on what's going on before he does that. And I might just add one other thing. He would not be the first governor-elect surprised by the fiscal situation he inherited. In fact, back in 1982, we had an incumbent governor, Jim Thompson. He had been governor since 1977, and when he won re-election, suddenly he discovered the fiscal situation was worse than he thought. So this is not an unusual kind of quote discovery.
Yeah.
Well, I know it was frustrating, I think, to a lot of folks that Bruce Rauner didn't get more specific on some of these policy issues when he was running. But now, for people who want to see a responsible and measured resolution to our budget problem, isn't it maybe a positive that he's not going out there and saying, well, I won't support this and I will support this, that he's indicating he has an open mind, possibly?
I think it's very prudent for him. I mean, he is a very smart individual that does not lack for self-confidence, but I think it's very prudent for him to try to build some relationships and get a lay of the land. This is uncharted territory, and he doesn't have a Republican administration that he's succeeding to fall back on. He doesn't have, as Governor Edgar had, these people, a core of people that are experienced with running state government, and so he needs to build those relationships. He needs, frankly, to just there are going to be probably contentious things having to do with collective bargaining, having to do with schools and vouchers. It would be a huge mistake to start dealing with those kinds of things at the same time. The critical problems are that you've got to put administration together, and you've got dual budget crisis. You've got a budget that doesn't work to get us to July 1st, and then you've got to put a budget together and figure out how to fund it in terms of the revenue for the coming fiscal year from 2015 to 2016, the FY16 budget, which is going to lose in another $1.5 billion in terms of if the whole temporary income tax goes away. And so if he doesn't, he's got to manage not to shut down the state before the 1st of July and then have a reasonable path to deal with the state's fiscal problems and budgets over the next 2 or 3 years. If he doesn't get that done, nothing else will matter. I mean, it's almost impossible to overstate how critical it is to focus on those issues.
Well, the Republican Party in Illinois definitely saw a big victory with Governor Rauner's win. They didn't do as well in the legislature, though. We have heard this week, though, that both of the Republican leaders in the legislature will remain, Christine Radogno and Jim Durkin. Any surprises there that there weren't any coups going on or any dissatisfaction that bubbled up enough for a swap at the top in either of the chambers?
They're both in difficult situations. They've inherited a terrible map from the perspective of a partisan perspective as Republicans. And so, the field was very narrow. Only a third of the Senate was up. You're kind of 2 competitive seats, and the Democrats got one, and Democrats held one and lost one. In the House, 700 votes in the other direction, and you'd ended up with the Republicans picking up 3 seats. And so, it's too early to kind of say that that this is their failure. Help may be coming from Rauner. The other thing is you can't beat somebody with nobody, and there are no strong, there's no obvious kind of successor in terms of competitor there that the opposition is going to rally around and stuff.
Well, and we'll have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Mike and Kent. And we know that there's a good chance that there may be a court ruling coming down on pension reform after taping this show, which is very unfortunate, but you'll have to tune into a future episode to hear all about it. So we'll see you next time on Capitol View.